what's the history of the use of this word?
I think Mr. Slow is muted. Mr. Slow, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Enrico. Good evening to all viewers, listeners. It's a pleasure to be here to participate in this very important subject. As indicated earlier, I am a former Assistant Commissioner of Police and Chairman of the Police Service Commission. I spent 37 years in the Guyana Police Force, so I'm fairly well familiar with the procedures and these things. And as indicated by Mr. Hughes a while ago, this is not the first time this word has been objected to. Over the years, even while I was serving, the word Negro was objected to. And during the tenure of Commissioner of Police, Winston Felix, a decision was made to have the term removed. And I think the recommendation then was for the words Guyanese of African ancestry to be used instead. And that worked for a period of time. And my information is that when Mr. Felix demitted office, sometime thereafter, not immediately after, because if you recall, when Mr. Felix demitted office, it was Henry Green, then it was Leroy Bromell, and following Leroy Bromell, it was Silal Prasad. I'm told that it was somewhere around that time that the word returned to the lexicon of the police. This, we know MN or FN, meaning male Negro or female Negro. So, and I did some further research, which I'll share a little later. And I want to say at this stage, contrary to the assertions of the Attorney General Anil Nandlal, SC MP, this word has not been in use in the police force for over 180 years. I have the evidence, which I'll present as we go along.
Could we hear from Ipadaji, where we have been making presentations to the United Nations? So, Olive Sampson, could you come in on this? Chime in.
Certainly, Enrico, thank you. Thank you again for the invitation to participate in this panel. Thank you to the audience for your interest in following this issue. It's a very critical issue, one that has a lot to do with the dignity and respect of people of Africa, for people of African descent. We have taken to the United Nations, I think the overarching issue here is that the Durban Declaration and Plan of Action, and drawing from that, in the decade for people of African descent and its plan of actions, both call on governments to take a close review of practices, of regulations, of the legal and institutional frameworks that are legacies of our enslavement and colonialism that are offensive, that are racist, and that affect our participation in the society without those stigmas that draw from the past and that affect our equal enjoyment of our citizenry in this country. And so this is just but one example of why it would be important for government to heed very, very carefully what all of the requirements that they are signatory to, all that it calls on the government of Guyana to do in order to adhere to the plan of action that Guyana has signed on to. Some countries have not taken it as seriously as others, but in a country like Guyana, we have the kind of racial divide and the kind of tensions that exist, it is really important that the government of Guyana adhere to and pay attention to the documents to which it is signatory that call on it to address the legacy of our enslavement and of colonialism.
Swana, as a young attorney, were you at all surprised that this word is still in use?
Good evening, Enrico. Thank you for the question. Firstly, I must say that the usage of this word Negro by government agencies or state entities such as the Guyana Police Force is not something new, which I personally have observed as a young attorney. On occasions during criminal trials or where evidence is disclosed in those cases, you will see the reference to a person of African descent, a male, as on X day, I arrested John Joe, male Negro. I put the allegation to Jane Joe, female Negro, on this particular day. So it has been something that I have observed and something that I would have discussed with my colleagues and something that we at Youth Peace and Slowly have discussed earlier and prior to this forum which we are now on. The recent incident with respect to Mr. Kidaki, I believe, is one that has warranted, the need for a public discussion and further discussion, a more solidified approach with respect to the use of this word Negro. So while it may be perpetuated in the media that the incident with Mr. Amsterdam is what would have stemmed the discussions of the usage of the word Negro by persons or the objections thereto. No, that has not been the case. This is just the occasion that we feel warrants an opportunistic discussions.
Let me move to Norris Witter. Thank you, Kishwana. Let me move to Norris Witter. You're a trade unionist. You know what has been happening in Guyana over the years in terms of the working class in particular. Do you believe that there's a reason for perpetuating this, shall I call it a stereotype in terms of the word? Remember to unmute.
Yes. First of all, Enrico, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And may I also take the opportunity to extend greetings to our listeners. First, I wish to state that for the word Negro to continue to be in currency, particularly within state institutions, is an indictment. 58 years after independence, 54 years as a republic. It is an indictment on all those who are determined to ensure that this word continues to be used. Now, other trade unionists, we take umbrage because one of our cardinal functions is to ensure that the dignity of all peoples are respected. And for anyone, any section of the society, to deliberately determine that there should be the continuation of the use of this word strikes at the very heart of what, in essence, our responsibility is as a trade union. But more so, it also impacts on the race relations. And I wish to pause here for this moment.
Therefore, the next step is, what is an acceptable word? What is a word that can be used? What ought to be used? I've heard African Guyanese heritage, African Guyanese descent. What are some of the suggestions? If I may go round the table again. I think I'll begin with Olive again. I'll begin with Olive this time.
I think African Guyanese speaks to our heritage and the pride with which we relate to our ancestors who were brought here from the continent of Africa It's succinct and it makes the point and it conveys with it a certain respectability and dignity.
Anyone else wants to chime in on that?
Enrico, I certainly believe very strongly that the appropriate description should be African Guyanese, male, female, or whatever preposition before that you wish to use. The fact of this, though, is it's not just the name that be used, it's what has to come with it. It's all the training, the retraining of the Guyana Police Force. And but yes, the short answer to your question is that African Guyanese is the term that should be used.
Let me go to Paul Slow. Again, Paul, remember to unmute your mic when you're talking.
Yes, right. So thank you, Enrico. I'm not sure what would be the recommendation of the term or words to replace the Negro. I indicated earlier during the tenure of Commissioner Felix, they had started to use the term Guyanese of African ancestry. Now, I just want to caution that whatever term we come up with, we must be conscious of the fact that the police use lots of abbreviations. So, for example, when they refer to male Negro, I know it will be MN, female Negro, FN, male East Indian, MEI, and the like. So whatever recommendation is made to replace the word Negro, we must be conscious of that because we don't want an abbreviation now which in itself creates some type of controversy. Because, for example, I can see that you're going to say African Guyanese. So when it comes to the female, they're going to say female African Guyanese, which is FAG. I don't know if that in itself will create a new controversy. So we have to be conscious of that.
But Paul, if I could stay with you for a second in terms of policing. Over the years, the police have used words and terms. Not only would they call people Negro, but then they would also put a nickname, a false name to them to further, shall I say, criminalize and make them look bad. How do we retrain that? How do we get people to understand it? One ought not to do that.
Well, again, I think you're saying the right thing. It calls for training because it's about human dignity. It's about human rights. And if policemen are trained in that respect, then they will come to understand that you arrest a man, let's say John Jones, and then you should not then tag on alias John Jones known as criminal, John Jones known as thief man, or something like that to further stigmatize that individual. But it will require for us proper policies, what we call standing orders from the organization, and not just only the creation of the standing orders, but making sure that training is done so that those things can be properly reinforced. Because once it becomes a standing order, it simply means that if you were to violate that, then you can be brought up under disciplinary charges. So again, it requires a buy-in by the administration and then the necessary training and reinforcement. And let me say this, this does not require any legislative change. It doesn't require, there's nothing, change to the police force standing order because there's no standing order which suggests that this word should be used. My research shows it's a practice that came on at some stage, I'm not even sure when, but certainly not 180 years ago, as stated by the Attorney General.
But let's go to what
sorry.
said.
Sorry,
Nigel, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a question for Mr. Slow, and this just arises from what he said. He says that it requires a standing order. My inquiry of Mr. Slow is, if there was a standing order under Mr. Felix that prohibited the use of the word Negro, was that replaced by another standing order? Because my concern now is not just the history of the use of this word as apparently the Attorney General wanted to suggest. Here, Mr. Slow is indicating that there was a sitting commissioner that gave a specific direction that the word Negro was not to be used. I'm assuming that might have been reinforced by a standing order or not, but the fact that it was reintroduced means that somebody with the intent it could only be with intent. With intent to use this degrading term, decided that they would set aside the standing order of Mr. Felix and say that African people must be described as Negro. And that, to me, if I'm only inquiring for Mr. Slow, that to me seems to be even more egregious than the use of the term, because it means that the police force recognized at some stage officially that this term was offensive, took steps to remedy it, and then somebody must have taken steps after that to reintroduce it. So it's almost as if you're reintroducing the term, the N-word, as a standard form of description. So that is my question, and forgive me for jumping in. It's just that it strikes me as being particularly disturbing.
Right, thanks for that question or the interjection, Nigel. What really took place is that the Commissioner Felix at the time gave directions. I think it was during a management meeting. Unfortunately, the other steps weren't taken to make sure that this was codified in his standing order as such. And I think therein lies the problem. Because if you are going to make an order, such an order, you have to go to the other logical steps to make sure that a standing order is created. The training, necessary training is done. That is so important, because just to say that we should discontinue using the word, and then the training and the sensitization is not done, we get exactly what we have now, people reverting to the use of the derogatory term.
I want to go back to something you said, Mr. Slow, with regard to the Attorney General. And the Attorney General put out a statement about 2 hours ago with regard to the fact that he never really said that the word should be used in effect on his Facebook page. What he was pointing out is that it was an opportunistic position by the attorneys representing Kadaki, and they're here, they can defend themselves. And why now? Because the police have been using that word for 180 years. You are saying that they have not been doing that, Mr. Slow.
Correct. They have not been doing that for 180 years, as asserted by the Attorney General. Basically, I have the statement from the Attorney General. I listened to the his program. I listened to that part of it only this afternoon. And because you say for over 100, and I'm quoting him here, for over 180 years, the Ghana Police Force has been using Negro to describe Afro-Guyanese, East Indian to describe Indo-Guyanese, Amerindian to describe indigenous Guyanese, etc. in their investigative documents without any objection whatsoever from any parties. And that is not so, because as some panelists have already said, people over the years have objected to the use of this word. We mentioned Mark Benchcop and others. And there's a book entitled History of Policing in Guyana by John Campbell. He is a former assistant commissioner, deceased assistant commissioner of police. And it's a beautiful book that I've always kept. And during the course of my research over the past few days, I came up with a table of some persons who were recruited in 1866, 1870, around that time. And what is striking, what is important, let me get it here. In 1873, for example, Police Constable 39, Simon Hunt, he was referred to as a black demerarian and a boatman. In the same document, 1876, Police Constable 82, Joseph Graham was described as a black demerarian, and he was a groom. And in the same thing, though, even they have, for example, 1886, Police Constable John Eastman, described as a black Barbadian. Police Constable in 1870, 201, William Frederick, black St. Vincentian. So to say that this word was used to describe black people of African descent since the inception, it's 118 years ago, it is not so. And the other question that might arise, well, I'm describing a policeman, whether a different term was used to describe persons who were brought into custody. I can find no such record. They were described, as I indicated, policemen described as black Demerarians. And in the book, there are other descriptions for other people. MEI, male East Indian, is there. And interestingly, you read again, you will find at some time, at some stage before that, East Indians were described in a derogatory term. We know what that is, the C word. And that fell away, and they started to describe them as male East Indian. And let me say this, because I put together some notes earlier, that when you look at the terms that the Attorney General mentioned, he said male Negro to describe Afro-Guyanese, East Indian described as male East Indian, Amerindian as Amerindian to describe indigenous Guyanese. None of those terms, when you describe a male East Indian or an indigenous Guyanese as Amerindian or as male East Indian, those things are not derogatory. So, but the use of the word Negro is a derogatory use of the derogatory uses, and that is the issue. So even if you say male East Indian and you're comfortable with that, you say male Amerindian or female and you're comfortable with that, we are saying that the word, to use the word Negro, which is derogatory, which is offensive, should not be used.
I want to read from an article by.
Enrico?
Go ahead.
I keep jumping in the program, but you mentioned the Attorney General and
Yes.
what he said, and you read what he said in his press release that was published a few moments before your program started. And this is what he said. He said the attorneys, i.e. me and Ms. Jefford, were opportunistic by only raising this issue when Mr. Kadaki Amsterdam was arrested, because Congressman Jackson was in the country. I think the Attorney General, if we take all his words into account, the first question is, why did they choose to arrest Kadaki when Congressman Jackson was in the country? The offense for which they have accused him of committing occurred in March. So they selected the time to arrest Mr. Kadaki Jackson. And he probably thought that our reaction would have been Negro. We would have lied down and taken it. How can you arrest someone who spends his entire being talking about African rights and put him in you put him in chains, you shackle him, and after you have shackled him, you call him Negro. And you want us as Negro attorneys to somehow say, oh, this is acceptable, Mr. Jackson's in town? No, not at all. The first thing the Attorney General should have said is this: we acknowledge that this term is offensive. It has been used for 180 years, and I dare say we offer an apology to all the African people in this country that we did not pick this up before, and this should have been addressed a long time ago. Had he done any work, he would have realized that Commissioner Felix had started this process, and he would have acknowledged the term. What does he do? The learned Attorney General seeks to attack the African lawyer for raising it when there is an African American congressman in town, and not once does he find a single word, not a single word of apology or condemnation for the use of the term Negro. So I think the Attorney General is, as we would say, very bold-faced to come and say he was attacking the opportunism of the attorney, where an African political activist was arrested, put in shackles, described as Negro, and you can't even find one single word to say the term is offensive. And the only reason that you choose to comment on it 5 minutes before this program starts is because you have been embarrassed. And even in that embarrassed state, you don't even have the decency to apologize for having used the term. Forgive me.
Nigel, isn't that the challenge that we have in Guyana with regard to looking at issues within or through the prism or prison of political expediency? Isn't that the problem?
Well, I don't know what you mean by political expediency. You mean the expediency between the two major races in Guyana? What specifically Politics in Guyana, sadly, after 60 years of independence, has remained exactly the same as it has done since 1950. And no party has attempted to address the core issue, or I should say no major party has attempted to address the core issue that confronts us. Ducking and hiding is not a way of dealing with a problem that is clearly national. So, not because I happen to be African, if this was somehow a term that was derogatory of any other group, the first thing I would have said is, look, I, as the Attorney General, I'm sorry that this term is still around. The fact that some lawyer jump up and uses it and only raises the objection now is not the issue. But you want to score cheap political points by saying, look, that black man there, only raising this now, and he's been practicing law for so long. The reality is, he has a commissioner, or had a previous commissioner, who clearly gave instructions, and who some subsequent commissioner reversed. That is a real problem. That is a problem we should be asking about. Why would any subsequent commissioner, any of any race, remotely consider it acceptable in the 21st century to reintroduce the word Negro? But
ladies and gentlemen, I want to put something out here. And sometimes we have to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And I can tell you from personal experience, there are people who think that if you describe an African Guyanese, a black Guyanese, not as black man or as African Guyanese or as a black Guyanese, and you say Negro and you say it with enough cultured tones that it sounds important, that you've overcome the challenge. And I've had to tell people, including people close to where I live, that it is okay to call me an African Guyanese. It is okay to call me a black Guyanese. You don't have to round your mouth and call me Negro. Olive?
Thank you so much, Enrico. The question to me, everybody has spoken to training, and I think that it speaks to the larger society, because it is one thing to train police officers about the use of the word Negro without the context of our history, our overall history, not the abbreviated version of a history that starts with our arrival as enslaved people in the 1620s, but a history that goes all the way back to the first civilizations of the world. The point that I'm making is that we have to instill in those officers and in the persons whom they may arrest a sense of pride, a sense of who they are. The word Negro is so derogatory, and the fact that both the policemen, who very often are African Guyanese, and those whom they arrest would do so, just speaks to some deeper issues, the legacies of our enslavement that very much affected us psychologically. The fact that we don't know our history, therefore, allows us to accept that term, that a police officer who is African Guyanese, and I'd like to ask Nigel whether the persons who were writing up that intake form were in fact African Guyanese, that they should feel comfortable referring to another brother and a political fighter as Negro, suggests to the larger problem of self-hate, of self-doubt, of accepting the second place position in our society. They are very careful not to refer to an East Indian person whom they arrest as anything but East Indian. Which brings me back to an earlier point that we were discussing, and that is, how do we derive an acceptable term of art? How will we be referred to? I think that we ought to look at the conventions currently in place, and as Paul pointed out earlier, address in that standing order the kind of concerns that you had, Paul, where an abbreviation might lead to a problematic acronym. And so we can address that in advance and train persons and train the public. The sensitization is not only of the police force, it's about the public. And Iparaji has called repeatedly for the teaching of history in our schools, from nursery through tertiary, and for public education programs that help to dispel these notions that there are second-class citizens in Guyana. Because this, to me, is an indication of the fact that some people are considered second class, and even among those people, there's a sort of resignation and acceptance of that second class status.
I want Norris Ritter to come in on this, and then I'm going to ask Attorney Jefford to also speak to it. And I'm looking at how others think that it may be the right way of saying it if you say it in a certain way. Norris, have you found that as an experience? Remember to unmute.
Said no, because probably my socialization was a little different. Now, the word Negro, as I understand it, was intended to be an upgrade to the word colored. And colored was intended to be an upgrade from the term nigger. So there is a nexus between nigger and Negro. But one has to appreciate the fact that when these terms were coined, when they were coined, and who coined them? They were coined by our enslavers. At a time when we were considered to be subhuman. So these terms were coined consistent with how we were perceived by the enslavers. But more than that, we as a people, we as an African people, we have never arrogated unto ourselves the right to define any other people. We hear about the Indians being referred to as East Indians. Those from Portugal who are descendants from India as East Indians, descendants from Portugal as Portuguese. The Amerindians, well, the jury is out. There are some Amerindians groups who are more comfortable with the term indigenous, some comfortable with the term Amerindian, and some who are more comfortable with the term First People. You have those who are descendants of Europeans, referred to as Europeans, but the Africans, who are the descendants of Africans, continue to be referred to as Negroes. It is time we stop this nonsense where other peoples, other races are arrogating unto themselves the right to define us. We must define ourselves. No one else must do that for us. It is time we put an end to this nonsense. And I think that Commissioner Sulal must answer to us as to why he reverted to the use of the term Negro. What was his intention? Too often, we have taken these blatant and vicious attack upon us too quietly.
Norris, but could I come in here? I don't think we have established with very hard evidence that it was that particular commissioner that caused it to happen. And secondly, even when you use the other N word, it jarred me. So I would prefer us not to use that word at all.
I only use it in
on
order
the
to show.
program.
I only use it to show the nexus between that N word and the other N word, right? And the last N word, Negro, is just as bad as the first N word, because the coiners of all those words are the same, and the intention was the same, right? My point is that we, as the descendants of Africans, must be given the right to determine how we should be defined.
Let me hear from Ms. Jeffrey.
You know, Enrico, the matter is simple. When we refer to indigenous people, we don't use the B word in official documents or in court proceedings. When we refer to persons of East Indian descent, we do not use the C word. When we are referencing persons from the Portuguese ethnic group, we don't use the abbreviated P word to describe them, Enrico. So why should we accept reference or being referred to as Negro? Negro is not an ethnic group, Enrico. It's a word, and it's a word that is highly offensive and derogatory. As Ms. Thompson would have highlighted, it has a past, a dark history. It takes us back to that era where there was this master slave mentality, an era of colonialism and slavery. And I believe, you know, the time has come for us to move past that and to have more socially acceptable and contemporary and correct reference to people of African descent in state agencies and other agencies across Guyana. And, you know, we can start it simply with education, raising awareness and sensitization. The media has a role to play, Enrico, in ensuring that persons of African descent are referred to correctly when they are publications and the like. Also, at the policy level, Enrico, we should have policies in place to ensure that state agencies are guided with respect to the correct usage of persons of African descent.
We've got about 10 minutes more on this program if we're going to go for an hour. But I was going to read earlier on from a former, a diplomat, person who served in the diplomatic corps here in Guyana and is also holder of both the LLB and the LLM. And he said, as an aside, let me call out the Guyana police force for still insisting that in this, the 21st century, for their protocols, someone making a report at a station is obliged to state their race. Granted that in cases of giving a description of a missing person or a suspect, such information may be relevant, but apart from the name, address, and contact information of the person making the report, their race and even their age is of absolutely no consequence to the arrest and or eventual prosecution of an offender, save and except in cases of, say, the rape of a minor. And the person pointed out that we seem to be stuck in the past. I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that just as a member of the press, I raised this matter as recently as 2000 and 2 years ago, 2022, with the Police Communication Division. I know the matter was raised by the Guyana Press Association in 2017. I know the matter was raised even before that by other persons. And we seem to be stuck indeed in the past. Why? What makes an administrative order so difficult to be put in place in Guyana? Nigel, come in.
Enrico, I like the very polite tones that you have elected to use in posing that question. What makes an administrative order so difficult? Enrico, imagine a classroom, in a kindergarten classroom, filled with African students who are no more than 2.5 to 3 years, and you describe them as my little Negroes. Are we seriously thinking that that somehow is just merely a question of a misdescription? I think the underlying fundamental problem, which has been touched on by Olive and Norris, is that the conditioning that has occurred over an extended period of time has led to the fact that in 2024, we are actually having a discussion about whether or not Negroes are acceptable. Let's put this in context. When the Caucasian people were during colonialism, were identifying which Black people were going to migrate into the middle class and become acceptable, and we had to speak properly and use knives and forks and all those fancy things, they would describe those people as Negro, almost as if, oh, it's acceptable, you've come of age, we can now describe you. And the history goes all the way back to the division between those of us that were in the field and those of us that were up in the house. So this is more than an administrative order. This here is a state institution, the Guyana Police Force of 184 years in 2024, justifying the use of the word Negro. Isn't it interesting that Mr. Kadaki Amsterdam was arrested, I think, on Wednesday? We are now Sunday night at 10 minutes to 8, and we have not even heard a single word from the Commissioner of Police acknowledging, first, that they use this term, secondly, that it is offensive, and thirdly, that upon hearing the complaint, he took immediate action to have it removed from the lexicon of the Guyana Police Force and further enforce that by giving a standard, whatever order it is that they call it. We have not heard a single word. The only official word that we have heard is from the Attorney General, who says it is opportunistic. Let's interpret that for what it is. It means that neither the Guyana Police Force nor the government of Guyana believe the people of African descent in this country deserve anything looking like an explanation, or better yet, an apology after 4 days, 5 days, however long it is, for how we could be living in a society, a modern society, a one Guyana society, and you have institutions that are using this most derogatory term, and you haven't got a single apology after 4 days. What does that say? It says you don't count, and in the end of the day, we don't care. Now, that's fine. I have a point of difference with Mr. Whittle. I don't care what anybody defines me as. I don't care if you say I'm opportunistic. I don't care if you say whatever you want to say about me. Only I define myself. And therefore, the African people are saying today, we are sorry. You will never describe us as Negro in any official document going forward. We have written to the Ethnic Commission, the ERC. We expect that they have acknowledged receipt of it. Whether they do anything is something else. But it must be a sad statement, Enrico, that 4 or 5 days after this statement, the Commissioner of Police, the Attorney General says, oh, it's opportunistic, can't find it within himself to say it's offensive and apologize. Nobody thinks that the African people are good enough to get a response. No, that is a message to the African people of where they stand. The discussion after that is what we do.
Olive,
Go
ahead.
Excuse me. I agree 100% with what Nigel just said, but I'd like us to also take into consideration the fact that this government has taken on this issue as though this is a minor irritation. Why are they complaining about this use of this word? But to me, the very fact that the police force continues to use this word, and we don't know what other government agencies use it in internal documents, or we don't know, just speaks to a larger issue. It speaks to how we are perceived in the society. I don't think we can sit here and not make that assumption. All that has been said by the Attorney General, by the very lack of response, suggests that yes, we are seen as the quote unquote Negroes of 2024. We are seen as Negroes. And so I worry about, for example, with the connotation of Negro as subhuman, as second class, a police officer arresting someone is not unlike a white police officer who is racist, like in the George Floyd instance, feeling that he or she is dealing with someone whose civil rights, whose human rights do not have to be respected because you're a Negro. You're not equal to any other member of our society. And so we have, I think, a problem. This has opened to me the gate of an examination of how we are being treated unfairly across the society, because there are innumerable ways. And the government's lack of interest in truly adhering to the plan of action that has been laid out by the Durban Declaration and by the Decade for People of African Descent speaks volumes in this context. The fact is that the United Nations, through the Durban, coming out of the Durban Declaration, the Durban Conference, made it very clear that people of African descent globally are still affected by the legacy of slavery. And here are the things that states need to do to remedy that. This government says there is no need for remedy. That is very clear. They have made it clear through their statements at the UN that there are laws on the books. Whether those laws are implemented or not, they acknowledge the fact that they have signed these conventions. The fact that they take no action on those conventions says a lot. And then we should accept Negro. That's what we're being told. We should accept being called Negro. That is very telling.
Someone said to me, but are there more pressing issues than what we are called?
Are there more pressing issues than our dignity, than not being seen as subhuman? I'm not sure. That is at the base. And I want to say one more thing. In 1839, the police force was formed. And I think one has to go back to the roots of that in order to even see the bigger picture. Police force was not needed when we were captive on plantations and could be flogged, killed, maimed, beaten. I mean, every possible form of torture, right, was acceptable. And then, in order then to oppress and control this new freed Negro population, a police force was formed. A force, it speaks, that word says a lot. And that force continues to exist. We don't have a police service. That's a whole different category of organization. A police service provides service and support to its citizens, protects its citizens. And the police force, their major target audience is people of African descent.
Enrico, can I just
Yes.
perhaps offer an explanation for or a response to your question? The first one, just is in response to a question that Olive asked earlier. The police officers that arrested Mr. Amsterdam are not surprisingly African Guyanese. And they used the term Negro to describe him, and each and every one of them looked like him. So it's a self-description term. But to come back to your question about whether there are more important issues, we are here tonight because the Ghana Police Force arrested an African Guyanese during the visit of Mr. Jackson. We're not here tonight representing the political future of the country, the economic future of the country. We didn't suddenly wake up tonight and decide that this is what we want to complain about. The incident occurred. It was so offensive, we have reacted to it. If we want to have a discussion about important issues in the country that are way beyond race, we can have that discussion. But that's not why we're here. We're here because The arm of the state that arrested Mr. Amsterdam, put him in shackles and described him as Negro on Wednesday, and we are now on Sunday. And the only statement we got from the Attorney General is we are rowing boat because they've been using it for 184 years. And we have got no statement from the Commissioner of Police. We got no statement from the normally very vocally active other ministers and higher-ups in the government. That is why we're here. There are a lot of very serious issues that we can discuss, but that is not the focus of this program. So when people ask you that, they must understand that when they decode that question, what they're really saying to you is, why y'all African people complaining about this where we got more problems? So in other words, this issue is not sufficiently important to be discussed. So y'all shut up and stay in a corner. Be good Negroes. That is really what is behind that question. If we want to have a discussion about the future of the country and what is important, I am sure you and others can put this together. That's not why we're here. And just to let you know, we have an extra hour, so it's not no need to run off if you want to take questions from where.
Yeah, but because I don't want to bring up the issue of Mr. Amsterdam and the charges brought against him. Obviously, that is in the court, but I can probably hear people say, "Well, you're not focusing on what was said about what he said about 4 persons who, according to the Attorney General, happen to be East India."
Enrico,
You're only focusing on the fact that. Yeah, go ahead.
For interrupting you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Nigel Hughes is a defense attorney in this context. Nigel Hughes gets called by a client called Kadaki Amsterdam. What you asking Nigel Hughes to go and do? Say that Mr. Amsterdam is guilty and that he should never have said these things and condemn what is alleged to have been on his program? Are you serious? You want the defense attorney now to go and plead the client guilty? What kind of question is that? I don't understand how people can say that. I am the man's lawyer. You want me to condemn the statement that was broadcast on his program while he's being arrested or after he's been charged? Is that a serious question coming from the Attorney General? Does he walk his clients into jail? Because that's not my practice. I don't walk my clients into jail. And secondly, I have no moral position on anything my client does. If you get charged, I give you the best defense and I make sure that the system, as far as it can, delivers to you a fair trial. Is the Attorney General really asking me to issue a statement while I'm walking in with Kadaki Amsterdam saying, oh, what was said in the program was terrible. How can they talk about beheading people and putting it down? And using words like ethnic genocide, where he wants me to issue a public statement saying that Kadaki, my client, who's just hired me, just spoke about ethnic genocide. I mean, this is the level of discussion we have in Guyana. That really bothers me.
And Enrico, if I may, as Mr. Hughes highlighted earlier on, with respect to the charges brought against Mr. Amsterdam, we have a professional view with respect to same, which we certainly would disclose or express at the appropriate forum when the evidence is presented before the court. But I think what needs to be highlighted here, importantly, is that the use of the word Negro is not concerned with an individual, it concerns a race. And that is why we are here this evening. That is why we are starting the discussion with respect to the use of the word Negro to refer to a particular category of person or a race of person.
Let me go back to Olive, and then I'm going to come to Norris to give a comment on the same thing. We've also heard that, look, we have to disaggregate, is that the word being used, in terms of ethnic minorities and divisions within the country. So we, as my mother used to say, we can't talk one for Paris, two for night. We don't want this term used, but at the same time, we want to make sure that if African Guyanese or Amerindians are being treated a certain way, that is listed, or Portuguese for that matter, or Chinese for that matter. I have a personal problem when I go to a store and I hear people just calling the man Chinese man. I said, doesn't this man have a name? You know, So we have a challenge in the country with regard to how we deal with ethnic relations, don't we?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Obviously, my focus is on the questions that are facing people of African descent within the parameters established by the International Decade. And they are very far-reaching and encompassing because our very existence every single day is defined by a legacy of our enslavement and colonialism. And it is not surprising that this word is just one indicator, I think. Let me put it that way. This is one indicator of a larger series of issues that with respect to the legacy of our enslavement. And I think coming back to your specific question, you know, when we speak about the teaching of history, all boats rise, because the whole question of understanding who we are as of all races, when we got here, how we got here, and what we have done brings pride to everybody. The contributions of every single race, well documented, not only in a textbook, but it is a shame that we can ride all the way up the East Coast and not one, except for Victoria, the villages that were based on plantations that were purchased by people of African descent coming out of enslavement, a monumental achievement. There's no signage, there's no monument that speaks to that. Those are issues that cultivate pride in a people. And so whatever is the equivalent for the Portuguese who came here and for the East Indians who came here, the point is that in teaching our history, we create a more civilized society, a place where we have respect for each other based on an understanding and respect for what each of these groups, about their history, their culture, equal respect.
Norris? You've got to unmute, Norris. You're still not with us. In the meantime, could I go to Paul Slow then?
Yes, Enrico. The question of the usage of the word in Guyana, as we have been discussing, very offensive word indeed. But we have people of African descent in Caribbean countries, Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica, the smaller islands, Antigua, and all of those islands. It might be interesting for us to know how they describe African in those countries. Do they use this derogatory term? That might be something that we can research. Shouldn't be difficult to find out if Guyana is the aberration in this thing, which I suspect it might very well be. Suriname has a mixed population, Trinidad as well. Let us find out perhaps what the term they use, especially the police, in describing people of African descent.
Well, Paul, I can tell you, I've covered, as you know, federal cases in the United States, and I have had persons both from the prosecution and the defense, when they see wanted bulletins issued. Remember, there were quite a few during a certain period.
Yes.
And they saw that term. They asked me whether that term is still used in Guyana. And that in and of itself tells you that we seem to be back in 1838, if not before.
Yeah, I totally agree. The word, I can't recall seeing this word used officially in any other place. I have had the privilege of working in several islands, several countries in the Caribbean, and I cannot recall seeing that word used in any document, either official or unofficial.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? Norris, you're able to come back in?
But if I should continue while we try to get Norris, I mean,
Yes, Norris seems to have a senior moment.
Nigel made the point that apart from the statement from the Attorney General, of course, none of us, I'm not surprised by the statement of the Attorney General. There's not a word from the Acting Commissioner or anyone else. And I don't expect to hear any word from him or the Minister of Home Affairs as well. But I say this again, if they really want to address this issue, maybe they don't have to come publicly and to say, to give an apology. But it doesn't require any legislative change. I want to repeat that. All it requires a direction from what they call now the executive leadership team of the Ghana Police Force. And that is reinforced by what we call messages to what we call all station message. So tomorrow morning, even now, the commissioner can pick up a telephone and say, look, send out a message to all stations in Guyana that as with immediate effect, the word Negro shall not be used in any document. That's all it requires. And that can then be followed up with some standing order, which is published. And as I say again, training so that people will get to know, the ranks will get to know that this word is not a word to be used. But until such time that they do that, it will continue. It will continue.
We are focused on the Guyana Police Force, but I for some reason I think the discipline services as a whole use that word. I mean, I think the Guyana Defense Force, I may be wrong, but I doubt it, as Charles Barkley once said, and the Ministry of Health, when they are registering people, also use that word. And I'm just wondering if pedagogy and trade unionists like Norris and all the other civic society organizations ought not to come out and say, well, look, this word has a degrading, a derogatory meaning over the years, and it ought not to be used. And as I said, even people outside of the country have brought it to my attention.
And also,
bring it in again.
The question is asked to, they have census being done. It might be interesting to know what word is used to describe people of African descent in the census.
Yes, and I was going to ask Oliver. Thank you, Ms. Stevens.
I just would like also to draw the attention of the audience to the petition that we have started circulating, and Epadagy has, and ask that they sign that petition so that we can have the numbers to make that demand of the government. I mean, it should be enough that this issue has surfaced, and if it were indeed some kind of a slippage in practice, then obviously we would have heard that, I think, and there would be immediate correction. But it's apparent that we really need to urge the government to see us as full human beings and not subhuman. And so we need to make sure that we have this petition in large numbers. The people who sign, please do not fear that your name is going to be revealed, because I understand there is some fear that their names might be revealed and that they would suffer some kind of reprisal. No names, except for those people who choose to make a comment, names are not revealed.
You know what is interesting, though, is that I've never really heard persons at high levels of government referring to Guyanese of African descent who are serving in cabinet as we have 5 Negroes. I have Negro cousins or anything like that. And I speak to a former president every now and then about family matters. And he always speaks about the fact of his African Guyanese heritage. And he's not, if you look at him, you may be surprised.
Well, maybe
But
because
he
he
never
has
speaks of his
African
Negro heritage.
could it be that because that is because he has African Guyanese heritage? He would want to make sure that they are treated and seen as human and that they're dealt with dignity. Could that be? I don't know. It's worth asking. I don't know about the usage in interactions and in official interactions, statements outside of what we see in the public. But who knows what the conversations are like? I mean, I don't know. I don't claim to know, but one hopes that this is not as pervasive as one might think. One hopes.
And Enrico, if I jump in here, sorry. Mr. Slow spoke about census and how persons of African descent may be referred to in Guyana. I would just like to point your attention to in the US, in the United States, since the year 2013, the United States Census Bureau discontinued the use of the word Negro in its survey. And this was done after there was some public feedback and there was a societal shift to a more socially acceptable term of African American to refer to persons of African descent. So perhaps we may start there, or that may be a starting point for us in Guyana, as we seem to be lagging behind.
Enrico, I wonder
Go ahead.
If the question would be posed to the Negro Minister of Home Affairs, whether the predominantly Negro Guyana Police Force self-describes itself as Negro. How would the Minister of Home Affairs feel? Maybe he finds it acceptable. That is not relevant, of course, to whether or not this is acceptable, but I wonder if that's a term that he uses to describe himself.
Well, I won't be facetious to say that he is also named after a very famous African American in terms of Robeson, you know. But that is for another discussion.
May I just interject one thing, please? No, I just got a text message from someone who is familiar with the terms used in Trinidad and Tobago, and the term African is used and Indian. Negro is not used.
Norris, were you able to come in at this point? I was trying to get you in terms of the trade union movement.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are hearing you now.
I think the use or non-use of the term Negro from a governmental perspective has a lot to do with how we are perceived by the political directorate within the government. If they see us as subhuman, they will treat us as subhuman. If they see us as equals, I do not see the difficulty in mustering the political will to regularize the situation. So it becomes a question of how we are seen. Do they see us different to how our colonizers see us? What we are experiencing, is it a perpetuation of the attitude and behavior of the colonizers? Thus, there is no break in the way we are being treated by the government.
But that brings us to the point, though, Norris, of what I was asking earlier on. Within the government itself, there are African Guyanese. In fact, I jokingly used to call Odinga Lumumba the Minister of African Guyanese Affairs, MAGA for short, who describe themselves as African Guyanese. So they're African Guyanese if they're on one side of the spectrum, and Negroes if they're on the other side of the spectrum. Is that what you're saying?
No, I am not disappointed or surprised that those descendants of Africans are mute on this issue. They are mute because of the very manner in which the politics within the party is structured.
Enrico,
Yes, go ahead.
perhaps with your permission, I have a question to ask the panel, which is, and it's been sent to me. What happens on Monday or Tuesday if the government refuses to change that description being used by the Guyana Police Force? What would their views be on the next course of action without necessarily wanting to give away any particular development?
I'm just wondering, I think it was Desmond Tutu who said that in South Africa, they had a sign that Africans, blacks cross here, you know, and he said, yes, blacks are very cross here. So will it make Africans even more cross if that's the right terminology? Olive?
I'm not sure I heard Nigel properly. I think, Nigel, you were asking, what if on Monday the government issues a statement that they will make this change?
No, quite the contrary. What happens if by
The other way.
at the end of Monday or Tuesday, the government makes it clear that they do not intend to have the Guyana Police Force discontinue the use of the word Negro? What are the next steps that would be appropriate?
If I may, let me answer Nigel's question this way. Progress for the descendants of Africans have never been achieved without struggle. That is my short answer.
Olive, you wanted to come
I
in?
think it was, who was it? Is it Frederick Douglass? I think it says, power concedes nothing without a struggle. So yeah, I think that we would just have to keep pushing on this subject. And I think if the government takes that position, I think that would be confirming what I have suggested earlier, that this is not just the question of the use of the term Negro by the Guyana Police Force, but it would be saying to us that you, as people of African descent, are seen by us in those terms and all that term connotes. And that would be a very serious indictment of this government if they decide to remain silent and to not only issue a statement ensuring that this word is not used anywhere across government, but also ensuring that the sensitization of the public and the training of the police are in place, and not some wishy-washy 2-minute kind of thing. The in-depth response to what Ipatagy has been calling for, the essential inclusion of the teaching of history from nursery to tertiary and across the public, using the public airwaves to teach the history of all Guyanese, a thorough, correct history. Where we came from, the pride and power of the African civilizations that were the first in the world, the short chapter of our enslavement, and the amazing contributions of Africans to the building of this country. The very country from which many people are becoming wealthy would not have been possible without the free labor of enslaved Africans who were tortured every day for over 200 years.
We have on this panel, well, 1 second, Nigel, we have on this panel 2 persons who were arrested. Paul Slow, Norris, I think you were also arrested. How were you described? Paul?
Yeah, well, the truth is I was never booked, so to speak. So I don't know.
Not arrested, you were.
Yeah,
not arrested.
Because in my case, I guess it would have been a statement or statements from persons. I don't know for sure how I was described, but now that you have raised the issue, I would have to check to see if I was described as a male Negro. So I am not
You
sure.
may have been described as a BV Negro.
A BV. Maybe, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it was described. Perhaps I even have to check on my bail receipt to see what terminology was used on that document. But the question is asked: what if? Now, I am made to understand that a complaint was lodged with the Ethnic Relation Commission. So let's say the government decides to express that look, it's not going to be changed because according to the Attorney General, it has been used for 180 years without any objections, which is not true. And they decide it's not going to be changed. Perhaps we then wait and see what the Ethnic Relation Commission will do. And we will hope that they will treat this matter with the urgency it deserves and to give some type of, make some pronouncement as to the what they think about this word being used. Again, I say, the Attorney General indicated you refer to East Indians as male or female East Indian. The Amerindians as Amerindians. Nothing is wrong. We don't see anything being objectionable about the use of those terms. We're saying that to use the word Negro in 2024 is objectionable, and the word is derogatory, and it should be and again, I want to emphasize, it doesn't require any sitting of parliament or any big like that official gazette and all that. It requires a simple phone call and the follow-up action to make sure that the word, the usage of the word is discontinued.
Let me throw the cat among the pigeons here. I have seen, and I think most of us have seen, press releases from organizations that some of them are pressure groups, some of them are political organizations, some of them are promoters of African Guyanese resistance and what have you, that have referred to persons as host Negroes. So as going back to the story, we can't, say on the one hand that this is bad, and on the other hand, say, well, look, this term is acceptable if it's used as a pressure point. Nigel?
Well, a couple of things here I think that may be pertinent. We're talking about the official use of the word Negro, where organizations, whether they're Afrocentric or otherwise, use the term house Negro. I suspect that may be offensive, but our national poet, in one of his best poems, wrote, "I come from the nigger yard." It doesn't mean that you change the name of that poem, because that captures in that context exactly what that poem was about. So we need to reach the stage where we are respectful in the terms that we use to describe our fellow citizens. I rather suspect that depending on the context, that term would not be acceptable. But you would remember that must have been around 92, 93, we were described as being at the last rung of the social ladder. And you can pick coming through on both sides, terms that are not acceptable. So the first thing I would say is that we have to commit ourselves to a level of discourse, whether in press statements or otherwise, when we are treating with other people. The name House Negro may, in some specific context, if you're writing a historic piece, have a particular meaning. But I think in relation to that, I think all of us in Guyana, all races, all ethnicities, need to commit to a much higher and superior level of dialogue and exchange of ideas. So that's my response to that. I'm not attempting to justify somebody who's used that in a press statement. All I'm saying is we are better, we are capable of better, and therefore we should all commit to use language that is constructive, that is progressive, especially if we are going to live in the same space.
let me go back. Let me go back to something I said earlier on with regard to coverage of court cases, particularly in the federal court. And many times to be able to find out if somebody was Guyanese or if they came from the Caribbean, I had to go by the names. When I went to the courthouse in Brooklyn and in Manhattan, I asked them, well, couldn't I know whether this was a Guyanese person who came in, or somebody came in from Barbados and with drugs or what have you? They made it very clear that the requirement in the United States is that you can't say the national origin of that person. I don't even think you could say the ethnicity in the court. So you had to go to court and look at the person and say, hey, that is whatever. And that person came in from Guyana on such and such a time based on a complaint that was there. Never about race. It was never about which country they came from. Why are we, as my colleague said, in the 21st century, in this century, still behaving as if we're in 1834? I've gone back 4 more years now.
I think, Enrico, some of this information in a Guyana context may be necessary for the purposes of gathering data. So if you wanted to know, for example, how many African people were living in Aishalton, then the description may be necessary. In a society that is as polarized as ours, in a society in which there's so much ethnic division, and in a society where there are allegations that there's disproportionate allocation of resources, you have to disaggregate that data. And so the only way you can address a problem is if you have the data. And to get the data, quite often you have to use a descriptive term. And forgive me for using this example. We know that in 2022, no indigenous person, no person, what they call it, is from a riverine or hinterland area, got an A at CXC. That's a fact. Now, if we didn't have that categorization, we wouldn't know that there's a problem with education in the indigenous community. So I am not advocating that we don't use these terms. We need to collect data that is specific. There may be particular medical problems that confront the Indian population that don't confront the African population, and vice versa. And unless we use those terms and gather that data, it is important. What we cannot do is use derogatory terms for the purposes of capturing that data. So I understand in the US context where they may do that for the purposes of a trial, and that's for this reason. You don't want a judge who may or may not have subliminal biases when he sees the docket before the person comes into court, think, oh my God, it's another Mexican or it's another whatever. That's why they try to filter that out, because you want to ensure that everybody has as fair a trial as is possible. But I'm not sure that I am on the page where you don't use these terms because they're very useful for addressing specific problems for specific communities.
But you and I think the panel are saying that the term really should be African Guyanese or something like that, yeah. Right?
Yeah. There will be people who want to self-describe as Afro-Guyanese. That's fine for them. I think for official purposes, we should have a term. African. Indian comes from India. Portuguese, Guyanese connected to Portugal. Olive was very eloquent in identifying it. We don't come from Negro land. We are originally from the continent of Africa. That's where we got brought here. So as a descriptive term.
The interesting thing is Muhammad Ali, several years ago, made the same point that essentially, when you talk about the Chinese, that's because they come from Japan, from China. When you talk about the Japanese, they came from Japan. When you talk about the Europeans, they're from Europe. They came from a land.
But you see, here's where the prejudice is. The Portuguese came from Europe, but they're described as different from the Europeans in a Guyana context, because you wouldn't get 6 races if you didn't count the Portuguese as separate from the Europeans.
Well, Southern Europe and perhaps a touch of their African ancestry from the Moors the Moors having captured the Iberian Peninsula and lived for 700 years. I've always wondered about that. And I think it's another thing that one has to correct in our history because they're European. I mean, why are we making that distinction? Why do we carry that forward?
And I've also said it, Olive, and other persons on the panel. We like to talk about this land of six races. We have it in our constitution and in our songs and so on, and describe that particular group, the Portuguese, as separate. And I always remember traveling in Europe as a very young person, and I ran into a guy from Italy, and he told me that it is kind of a curse, because anything south of Rome was Africa.
Excuse me, anything south of Rome and east.
So we have to understand the history, and I think that's what you're saying, Olive, that we need to understand history. We need to also focus on our future in terms of Guyana as a country, that we need all the people that we have, and we should not be alienating people. Is that where we are going, Norris?
Interesting, It is widely accepted that Africa is the cradle of mankind. If that is so, then all those who call themselves Europeans and Portuguese and Chinese, they are all descendants of Africa. So we are all Africans. Caesar.
Norris is going to add another wrinkle, interesting wrinkle to this. But I have to agree, obviously, the first humans to ever walk the face of this earth over 268,000 years prior to any other group were Africans who were on this planet, as I said, 268,000 years before anyone. The first civilizations were African. Why do we have to accept that people would see us as subhuman and treat us in that way in 2024? It comes out of ignorance and out of a sense of some supremacy that is that has absolutely no foundation. We are all equal as human beings, and we should not accept that. And we need to teach who we are.
Enrico,
I want to wrap up here.
We wrap it
Yes.
up. But I just wanted to when I posed the question that came through about solutions, the governments of CARICOM, who were very quick to talk about the preservation of democracy and the preservation of the rights of people to vote, I think it needs to be brought to their attention that 4 years after their strident representations to make sure that the nation goes forward, that the government now thinks it's acceptable to describe parts of the African population or the entire African population as Negro, and whether in their countries they self-describe themselves as Negro. Because this needs to, for me, going forward, if the government continues with this course of action, this needs to be elevated to the highest levels of CARICOM, because we cannot possibly be talking about one Guyana, one Caribbean. We have to pool our resources. Guyana is fortunate now, therefore we have to go forward. And you have a clear position adopted by the government that says that 30 whatever percent of the population is Negro. And if that is a contradistinction to a place like Jamaica that has given us Bob Marley, that has given us all these athletes, that has given us such a rich cultural heritage, or Trinidad that has given us a rich cultural heritage throughout the country, and then you come to Guyana, the history of African people here also very rich. So I think as we are one Caribbean, this needs to be elevated to that level, because the heads of government don't speak for themselves. They represent the entire constituency of the Caribbean. And the Caribbean has to be made aware that the government of Guyana thinks it's acceptable to describe people of African origin as Negro. And I think we need to expand that to other organizations. We need to alert the trade union movement in the Caribbean. We need to alert the civil society movements in the Caribbean. We need to alert all the movements in the Caribbean, the Calypsonians, the artists, that in Guyana, the government has said black or African people are Negro. And we have to get a reaction for that, because we can't talk about going forward. We can't talk about being one nation, and it's acceptable to have a population described in those derogatory terms. So I'm sorry for having jumped in for that, but I think we really need to concentrate on what the next steps are. I think we certainly need, on a domestic level, to go out into various communities, particularly those communities in Africa, and expand upon this discussion. So all of us kindly refer to the petition, but I think this needs further work, further build out, that we go out in other African communities and find out whether they are comfortable with the state describing them as Negro.
Yes, and thank you, Nigel, for that intervention. And I'm going to go around the room, so to speak, the Zoom room, to get the next steps. And I'm going to go to Shishwana on the next step.
You know, Enrico, I believe that first of all, it starts with us having a mentorship with how we see ourselves and how we see each other. Like Mr. Hughes rightfully highlighted, the two police officers who would have arrested Mr. Amsterdam were persons of African descent, and they had no issue with referring to Mr. Amsterdam as a person of a Negro descent. Now, to me, it starts there with how we view ourselves and each other. On a larger scale, I believe that this is an easy fix. It could be done with a directive to the Guyana Police Force to have the use of this word eliminated from police documents and the like. More particularly, Enrico, I believe that we as individuals and at the policy level need to continue to advocate for there to be change in this regard. You know, we can do this through sensitization, through awareness, through training programs. The Ethnic Relation Commission, as the constitutional body which has the oversight for, you know, good ethnic relations and harmony amongst the races in Guyana, we can start there. I know that they have issued a letter, or they have been addressing the issue, and I would commend them for that. But I believe, in closing, collectively, each of us has a role to play in having this word eliminated from official documents and used throughout Guyana.
Mr. Slow?
Yeah, yes, Enrico. You know, listening to Ms. Jafford there, it occurred to me that I think what we have to do is look, we have to go forward. What happens from tomorrow going forward? Because if we are going to ask that the word be struck from the records, we have to be careful with that, because you're going to have record in archives, you're going to have police files.
No, you don't change those.
Pardon me?
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, you have police files, that the statements that were taken perhaps 2 weeks ago. I don't think we want them to go back there now and to change the word, whatever word they used. I think that's going to be logistically very, very difficult. But what I was saying, I said this before, that all it requires is a phone call and say, from now on, this is what will take place, and to make sure that is reinforced in all the ways it can.
Norris?
Consistent with what Nigel said and what you've suggested too. You know, I think it was Marcus Garvey who said that a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. I think what is required will be a very aggressive educational sensitization campaign to ensure that what we are setting out to achieve is achieved. Because it is clear to us that we are dealing with a government that only concedes when enormous pressure is applied.
Olive?
Thank you, Enrico. So, I agree with Nigel, his last point about ensuring that we engage the wider CARICOM community. For our part, at Ipadagy, clearly we have a membership of 80 organizations, and we will be engaging them on this subject to hear from them their views. I should mention that one of our organizations, Ghana Day, actually in 2012, wrote to the Attorney General demanding that this word Negro be struck and not used again. There was no response. So I think we ought to be very cautious of any attempt. Well, let me put it differently. We should be cautious that if government quite suddenly capitulates and says we are no longer going to use this word, we have to make sure that there is sincerity in not only the ceasing using the word, but all that it connoted in terms of their treatment of people of African descent. Because we have to remember that not only are we being referred to as Negroes, but we are being treated as second-class citizens. There's lack of equity across this society. So we cannot have one without the other. We must see an improvement across the board. It's not sufficient to simply say that from tomorrow, the use of the word Negro will disappear. Where are the other indicators of our treatment as equal human beings, equal citizens of this nation? So I call on the government to take this opportunity of the revelation of the use of this word to not only cease and desist, but to step back, examine the treatment of people of African descent here in Guyana, especially as we have this booming oil economy. We're not looking for gold scholarships only, a house lot, but not acres and hundreds of acres of farmland. We don't get that. We don't get large contracts. I mean, there are many ways in which we are still being treated as Negroes. It's not only about the use of a word. We demand to be treated equally.
Thank you, Olive. Thank you. Unless anybody else wants to chime in, thank you, Ms. Jeffords. Thank you, Paul Slow and Norris Witter. I think Nigel, you wanted to.
I just want a closing remarks. One, the first thing that has to happen, in my humble view, is that every African person who interacts with the Guyana Police Force demand that if they're writing about you, they use the word African. Two, every agency, including the Guyana Defense Force, with immediate effect, if they give you a badge that describes you as Negro, if there's any document that you have that describes you as Negro, refuse to sign it, refuse to accept it. Three, I don't have much faith the government will do anything about it. So I suspect this needs to be elevated, not only to CARICOM, but it has to go global. Because the only time you get a reaction from this government on matters of African affairs is when we go international. Olive can tell you that if you didn't go to Geneva to speak about the problems, you would get zero reaction from the government. So don't expect the government in the domestic sphere to react. I don't expect them to react. What I will say is that we have work to do, both in CARICOM. We need to contact all those agencies, provide them with the data. We need to go international. We need to make sure the State Department is aware of this. We need the ABCE countries. Let's hear where you stand on this. And this needs to be elevated to the level of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, the UN Human Rights Commission, and the people, African people of the world, and the people who are sympathetic to their causes need to understand what's going on, and we have to do that work to get that out to them as a matter of urgency. And the third thing is we ourselves have to act to protect ourselves. So we need to go into communities, African communities, to talk about this. We need to have more programs like this to sensitize the entire Guyana community about this issue. And it's not about why are we fighting about this now. There are bigger issues. Guyana has a lot of issues, and we have solved none. So this is a plan in relation to this issue.
Thank you very much, gentlemen and ladies. It has been an interesting discussion, and I hope that we can continue the discussion with regard to making sure that things happen. You know, the saying is there are three types of people in the world: those who make things happen, those who wonder what happened, and those who say what happened. You know, so let us make things happen. And thank you very much to Nigel Hughes, Norris Ritter, Kinawa Jeffers,
It's one.
Paul Slow, sorry, Kiswana Jeffers. I butchered your name, my apologies. And of course, Olive Sampson. On the panel, we had the attorneys from Hughes, Fields and Stobie, the former Police Service Commission chairman and former Assistant Commissioner of Police, trade unionist, and the CEO of Epadagy. We thank the technical people who have been working in the background to make this happen. I'm Enrico Wilfred. Have a pleasant rest of the evening. Goodbye for now.